begituan gitu loh.
Sesuai dengan yang ada.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Shalom, Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, salam kebajikan. Selamat siang serta salam sejahtera bagi kita semua. Yang kami hormati, Wakil Menteri Lingkungan Hidup dan Kehutanan. Yang kami hormati, Direktur Jenderal Kekayaan Negara. Yang kami hormati, Staf Ahli Menteri Lingkungan Hidup dan Kehutanan Bidang Pangan. Yang kami hormati, Direktur Penilaian. Yang kami hormati, para pejabat di lingkungan DJKN. Yang kami hormati para narasumber kita hari ini dari Cambridge University dan World Bank. Yang kami hormati Bapak dan Ibu perwakilan dari kementerian atau lembaga. Yang kami hormati Bapak dan Ibu perwakilan dari World Bank. Serta yang kami banggakan Bapak dan Ibu peserta webinar. Bapak dan Ibu yang berbahagia, kami ucapkan selamat datang dan selamat bergabung dalam webinar dengan judul Realizing the Value of Nature, Biodiversity, Financing, and Green Tourism. Seperti judulnya, dalam webinar kita pada hari ini, kita akan menggali lebih dalam mengenai peluang keanekaragaman hayati serta ekonomi, juga wawasan mengenai pariwisata berbasis alam hijau. Materi hari ini akan disampaikan oleh para narasumber hebat yang telah berpengalaman di bidang. Perkenankan saya Regina Ria yang akan memandu rangkaian acara kita pada siang hari ini. Bapak dan Ibu sekalian, marilah kita sejenak berdoa untuk memohon kelancaran acara serta sebagai ungkapan rasa syukur kita kepada Tuhan Yang Maha Esa. Berdoa kami persilahkan. Berdoa selesai. Baik Bapak dan Ibu sekalian, kami juga ingin mengingatkan untuk menggunakan virtual background webinar, di mana Bapak dan Ibu dapat mendapatkannya dan mengaksesnya pada link /webinar SDA yang telah disampaikan di kolom chat. Dan di dalam link tersebut terdapat materi, absensi, serta form evaluasi yang dapat Bapak dan Ibu isi untuk mendapatkan sertifikat. Sebagai informasi, dalam virtual background kita pada hari ini terinspirasi dari salah satu fauna, yaitu julang Sulawesi, yang merupakan salah satu spesies burung rangkong yang endemik di Sulawesi. Hewan ini juga merupakan salah satu hewan yang dilindungi dan berada di hutan primer atau hutan rawa. Baik Bapak dan Ibu sekalian, memasuki acara selanjutnya, kita akan mendengarkan opening speech dari Wakil Menteri Lingkungan Hidup dan Kehutanan. Kepada yang terhormat Bapak Alu Dohong, kami persilahkan.
Terima kasih Pak Ria, Regina Ria ya. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat siang, salam sejahtera untuk kita semua. Swastiastu, Budaya, salam kebajikan. Yang saya hormati Bapak Ronald Sibaban, Menteri Kekayaan Negara, Mr. Matthew Adar Wanda, Cambridge University Biodiversity. Mr. Maurice Andres Rhodes, now David Action from para bicara, partisipan dan hadirin sekalian yang saya katakan, Selamat siang, pertama-tama saya ingin menyampaikan selamat saya serta webinar Biodiversity Valuation, Rising the Values of Nature, Biodiversity Finding from Indonesia. Saat ini bertempat di 2000. Juga ingin menyampaikan apresiasi kepada World Bank Group, sekretariat, dan para mitra atas kooperasi mereka dalam mengorganisasi stabilisasi saya dan dunia. Hadirin sekalian, Bapak Ibu yang saya hormati, adalah suatu kebahagiaan saya bisa hadir secara virtual untuk menyampaikan beberapa perspektif, pemikiran terkait isu valuasi ekosistem terhadap terkait pengalaman kita selama ini dan juga bagaimana kita pihak-pihak lain bisa belajar saling mengembangkan pengetahuan karena kita bergerak cepat. Dan karena saya sampaikan bahasa Indonesia ya, teman yang luar negeri mungkin ada yang masa meraihnya nanti. Kita tahu bahwa biodiversity adalah bagian dari desa ekosistem khusus yang ada di kawasan ekosistem hutan, samping ada air, karbon, penanaman wisata atau scale beauty, masuk juga food, fibers, dan lain-lain. Dan seluruh komponen jasa lingkungan tersebut secara luas digunakan. Namun tidak banyak yang di-reveal secara benefit di dalam konteks pemanfaatan yang diperoleh oleh baik oleh pemerintah, negara maupun masyarakat secara luas, kecuali yang selama ini yang kita peroleh lewat lima negara berpajak konteks atas penggunaan biodiversity yang tadi. Nah, jasa ekosistem ini termasuk biodiversity di dalam sebetulnya belum ditetapkan sebagai aset negara karena disebabkan oleh adanya keterbatasan valuasi sistemnya banyak dari sehingga sangat diperlukan memahami lebih dalam, menggali lebih bagaimana cara kita menentukan jasa ekosistem ini sebagai aset yang memiliki valuasi secara moneter. Maka beberapa hal pembelajaran yang bisa kita pelajari antara lain bisa bagaimana kita menentukan penilaian atau assessment dan penetapan metode evaluasi. Kemudian bagaimana nanti kelembagaan mengelola aset jasa. Bagaimana sistem ini termasuk regulasi yang dipakai di dalam akan tetapi bahwa guidance dari Kementerian Keuangan, Kementerian PHK, Bank Dunia telah memulai bagaimana mengevaluasi nilai jasa ekosistem. Tapi ya beberapa kali saya sampaikan dibutuhkan pengkayaan dengan pemahaman yang lebih luas dalam melakukan evaluasi ini, terutama terkait bagaimana penetapan aset sumber alam ini, termasuk bagaimana keterkaitannya dengan social culture dari local community. Kemudian bagaimana peran masyarakat di dalam mengelola jasa ekosistem ini, yang nanti kita mungkin sebagai aset, gitu ya. Kemudian capacity dari human resources di dalam mengembangkan aset, terutama aset financial, kita melakukan valuasi resources ini adalah bisnis, termasuk di dalam bagaimana pemanfaatan teknologi. Dan biodiversity ini dengan perkembangan bioteknologi sekarang, dengan perkembangan digital sequencing information, sebetulnya bisa menjadi, saya berulang menjadi the new emerging revenue bagi bangsa Indonesia yang sifatnya lebih tinggi bioekonomi, bukan tahun ini yang perlu kita pikirkan. Kemudian juga diperlukan pengetahuan khusus di dalam kita mengelola jasa-jasa yang nanti misalnya digunakan sebagai aset kita, dan bagaimana konteks mengembangkan regulasi mengenai ini menjadi PR yang harus kita lakukan. Bapak Ibu sekalian yang saya hormati, kita tahu Indonesia ini merupakan negara mega biodiversity country. Kita berdasarkan Global Biodiversity Index, kita nomor kita masih tahun. Dan biodiversity kita lebih dari 490 ribu spesies terbagi di dalam 19 dengan lebih dari 74 tipe vegetasi dan lebih dari juga banyak jenis-jenis lainnya yang perlu kita identifikasi, dan tentu ini menjadi kekayaan hati. Karena ini pada kesempatan yang baik ini saya ingin bagi beberapa perspektif terkait isu ini. Yang pertama adalah penting kita untuk melakukan balance penggunaan sumber daya alam termasuk biodiversity dengan konservasi. Dan juga kita tahu misalnya di Indonesia ini sumber daya alam dan biodiversity itu menyumbang hampir 36% dari total ekspor kita di tahun 2001 atau 10% dari GDP. Artinya ini belum kita kelola dengan lebih optimal lagi kesumbangannya ini. Jadi dia bisa jadi backbone ekonomi green, bioekonomi berikutnya kita ke depan. Kita bisa kelola dengan baik dengan perkembangan teknologi dan sebagainya. Indonesia juga menempatkan prioritas tertinggi untuk memastikan bahwa mega biodiversity kita ini dikelola secara berkelanjutan dan implementasinya berdasarkan 3 pilar seperti kita sampaikan, yaitu pertama pilar protection dari life support system. Jadi ini paling utama sebagai perlindungan penyangga kehidupan kita ini. Kalau dia dari habitat kita hilang, maka tentu life support system kita itu akan berkurang dan berubah. Kemudian yang prinsipnya kedua adalah preservasi dari biodiversity, masuk genetic resources dan ekosistem. Dan yang ketiga sesuai dengan Funding Montreal Global Biodiversity bahwa kita harus menerapkan sustainable and wise use of natural resources. Jadi itu penting kita lakukan kedua prinsip. Maka usaha-usaha tadi, 3 hal usaha atau seperti itu harus didukung juga dengan sistem regulasi kita, strategi dan action plan yang kita miliki. Dan tentu kita harus kaitkan dengan prinsip-prinsip sustainability dalam misalnya melakukan kegiatan perdagangan biodiversity kita, wildlife, flora, dan fauna, termasuk kebijakan kita menuju prinsipnya CITES dan juga kebijakan terkait dengan biodiversity dan perdagangan lainnya. Saya percaya bahwa kebijakan akan mensupport pencapaian tadi. Tujuan dari ekonomi Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework atau IMG. Saya percaya juga target-target dan goals yang ditetapkan di dalam IMGBF itu sifatnya adalah global, bukan akan kompleks. Dan setiap negara berkontribusi terhadap capaian global biodiversity tersebut berdasarkan prinsip CBDR, common prinsip differentiated responsibility, taking account kita respective national circumstances, priorities, and backup. Yang kedua, Indonesia kita tahu saat ini sedang memfinalisasi dokumen Indonesian Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan. Kemarin saya memimpin langsung rapat steering committee dari saat ini. Diharapkan secepatnya akan di launching bersama Agustus 8 Agustus ya, rencana target jadwalnya dilaunching oleh beberapa menteri sebelum kita submit ke CBD Secretariat. Target kita ya Agustus itu juga sebelum COP 16 ya. CBD di Bali. Nah, di dalam ibsar kita, Bapak Ibu semuanya, beberapa fokus terkait dengan beberapa tujuan. Yang pertama, memperbaiki integritas dan konektivitas dari ekosistem alam. Yang kedua, mengurangi potensi ancaman dari kehilangan biodiversitas. Jadi kalau kehilangan biodiversitas kita terjadi, sebetulnya potensial menurunkan kesejahteraan kita, menjadikan warga negara kita bisa lebih miskin. Nah, sebagian besar kan biodiversitas itu juga bagian dari pangan, bagian dari energi dan seterusnya. Yang ketiga, mengoptimalisasi penggunaan secara berkelanjutan biodiversitas melalui pendekatan tadi ya, bioekonomi, green economy, blue economy, termasuk penggunaan kearifan pengetahuan tradisional dan pengetahuan lokal, termasuk praktek-praktek pengetahuan dan kearifan lokal, termasuk juga kesetaraan gender. Dan kita lagi kita. Dan yang keempat, memperkuat tata kelola dan mobilisasi sumber daya untuk pengelolaan biodiversity yang lebih baik. Makanya webinar evaluasi ini menurut saya sangat strategis. Nah, kita akan tiba pada suatu yang minimal approximately the best estimate for our ecosystem services foundation. Jadi kita punya gambaran tentang nilai aset jasa ekosistem yang ada di seluruh tipikal ekosistem yang ada di Indonesia, sehingga kita bisa melakukan pengelolaan dengan baik dan memobilisasi sumber pendanaan. Saya juga yakin Indonesia percaya bahwa seluruh tujuan-tujuan dan target yang itu sifatnya global. Kemudian sekali lagi kontribusi Indonesia adalah tetap memperhatikan prinsip-prinsip CBDR, termasuk memperlihat dan menghargai kondisi nasional kita, prioritas nasional dan kapasitas. Baik, hadirin sekalian, saya berharap bahwa Indonesia di masa depan akan menjadikan biodiversity itu dikelola dengan hutan, dikelola berdasarkan aspek-aspek regulasi yang prudent, serta bisa di traceability dengan baik di tingkat nasional dan internasional. Karena sebetulnya biodiversity Indonesia itu banyak leakage-nya, Bapak. Leakage keluar kemana-mana, kita tidak menerima apa-apa. Kalau kita sudah punya instrumen accessibility, kita punya instrumen global terkait Nagoya Protocol dengan aset benefit sharing dan CITES, Cartagena dan sebagainya. Tapi ini harus menjadi perhatian. Kemudian ya tadi isu akses dan benefit sharing perlu kita tekankan terhadap pentingnya bagaimana memperkuat pengelolaan genetic resources sambil melihat atau mempertimbangkan risiko dan security di dalam pengembangan dan penggunaan. Saya juga perlu menyampaikan bahwa kita harus melihat potensial tadi yang saya sampaikan penggunaan digital sequencing DSI di dalam mendevelop high value product kita yang saat ini juga Kementerian Lingkungan dan Kehutanan sedang memformulasi peraturan menteri kelapa terkait dengan akses dan benefit sharing atas penggunaan biodiversitas, termasuk memperkuat sistem informasi biodiversity, termasuk memperkuat balai clearing biodiversity yang kita miliki. Pada tingkat genetik, kita sudah mempromosi penggunaan secara komersial genetik resources kita, baik prospecting, seperti misalnya Taxus sumatrana untuk anti cancer, Bajakah atau lianas untuk juga anti cancer, kemudian mikroba untuk anti frost, Lidemia hirta untuk pengobatan dan seterusnya. Itu sumber kekayaan keragaman hayati kita yang memiliki potensi untuk sumber bioekonomi berkelanjutan. Bapak Ibu sekalian, untuk menutup opening remark saya ini, saya sangat berharap bahwa dari diskusi-diskusi nanti ya, dari para narasumber atau dari masukan-masukan peserta hari ini, kita bisa mendapatkan jalan terbaik untuk bergerak ke depan. Ya. Untuk menyatukan semua pandangan dan perspektif kita bersama, untuk bekerja lintas sektor, bukan sektoral, ya, dan melibatkan semua pihak stakeholders untuk men-sharing dan belajar dari bersama dan untuk menghasilkan ya, rekomendasi kebijakan yang konkret dan rencana aksi yang real sehingga bisa mempercepat implementasi dari biodiversity plan kita tadi kita tahu bahwa kehilangan biodiversity telah menjadi salah satu tantangan global terbesar. Jadi one of the threat of planetary crisis. Dan itu harus kita atasi bersama karena kita berharap kita menemukan strategi sendiri dan rencana aksi yang menjadi solutif atas biodiversity loss challenge yang kita hadapi. Saya kira itu beberapa hal yang saya sampaikan, Bapak Ibu semuanya, mudah-mudahan bermanfaat dan sekali lagi saya berharap webinar hari ini memberikan rekomendasi kebijakan dan action plan yang tepat, dikelola biodiversity baik di masa yang akan datang. Terima kasih. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Om Santi Santi.
Baik, terima kasih kepada Bapak Aludhong yang sudah menyampaikan opening speech-nya Pak dalam acara webinar kita pada hari ini. Bapak dan Ibu sekalian, kita akan mendengarkan yang selanjutnya ada sambutan dari Direktur Jenderal Kekayaan Negara kepada Bapak Rional Silaban. Kami persilakan.
Terima kasih, Ria. Yang saya hormati Bapak Wakil Menteri Lingkungan Hidup dan Kehutanan, staf ahli Menteri LHK di bidang pangan, Direktur Investasi Gas Rumah Kaca dan Monitoring Pelaporan Verifikasi, dan juga Mr. David Kazan, the Senior Economist from the World Bank, Matthew Agarwala from Cambridge University, Maurice Rollins from the World Bank, dan Bapak Ibu sekalian yang ada di sini bersama-sama dengan kita. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, salam kebajikan. Pertama-tama kita panjatkan puji syukur kehadirat Tuhan Yang Maha Kuasa, karena atas berkat rahmat karunia-Nya kita bisa bersama-sama menghadiri webinar Realizing the Value of Nature, Biodiversity, Financing and Green Tourism. Bapak Ibu hadirin sekalian, di Indonesia modal alam khususnya yang bersifat hayati masih sangat bernilai dan dapat dimaksimalkan untuk meningkatkan pertumbuhan ekonomi, sekaligus menghindarkan Indonesia dari middle income trap. Modal alam berupa hutan, ekosistem hutan, serta keanekaragaman hayati dapat menjadi basis berbagai kegiatan ekonomi, seperti industri wisata hijau atau green tourism, dan industri yang memanfaatkan sumber daya genetik. Kesadaran akan pentingnya modal alam tersebut berjalan seiring dengan kesadaran dalam mengatasi dampak perubahan iklim maupun ancaman lainnya. Inisiatif dan strategi yang telah dilaksanakan untuk mencapai tujuan tersebut, diantaranya penyusunan kebijakan dan pendanaan keanekaragaman hayati, serta pariwisata hijau berbasis alam yang ramah lingkungan. Oleh karena itu, kolaborasi lintas sektor menjadi sangat penting untuk dapat menciptakan solusi yang inovatif dan berkelanjutan. Dan ini perlu terus dilakukan berbagai pihak. Komponen ini merupakan komponen penting dalam strategi global untuk melindungi ekosistem alam dan mendorong pertumbuhan ekonomi yang berkelanjutan. Bapak Ibu sekalian, kami mengucapkan terima kasih kepada para narasumber dan juga seluruh peserta yang mengikuti kegiatan webinar ini. Kami berharap dengan webinar ini dapat memberikan wawasan kepada kita untuk berkomitmen pada pelestarian keanekaragaman hayati, khususnya untuk memahami bagaimana kita bisa memobilize financing bagi kegiatan alami. Dan kami juga berharap dengan ini maka kita bisa mendapatkan suatu masukan, karena kita juga akan mendengarkan dari apa yang telah dilakukan oleh negara lain di dalam mereka mengembangkan perekonomian berbasiskan alam. Dan untuk itu ini merupakan masukan yang baik bagi kita dalam mengembangkan pariwisata hijau berbasis alam yang berkelanjutan dan pertumbuhan ekonomi yang berkelanjutan. Itu yang ingin disampaikan. Sekali lagi kami mengucapkan selamat kepada Bapak Ibu sekalian untuk mengikuti webinar hari ini. Terima kasih. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam. Terima kasih banyak Pak Rio atas sambutan yang telah disampaikan. Izin untuk Pak Aludohong serta Pak Rio kami ucapkan terima kasih untuk kehadirannya. Kami sangat senang apabila Bapak masih bergabung bersama kami. Namun bila mana Bapak memiliki kegiatan lain, kami persilakan untuk melanjutkan kegiatan tersebut. Terima kasih Pak Rio dan Pak Aludohong. Bapak dan Ibu sekalian, materi utama kita pada hari ini akan disampaikan dalam bahasa Inggris. Untuk itu, kami juga sudah menyediakan interpreter dalam aplikasi Zoom. Bapak dan Ibu dapat menekan menu interpreter dan memilih menu bahasa Indonesia untuk mempermudah dalam penggunaan bahasa dalam webinar ini. Kami juga ingin menginformasikan Bapak dan Ibu bahwa di pertengahan acara ini akan disampaikan kata kunci oleh moderator untuk pengisian data dalam sertifikat. Baiklah Bapak dan Ibu sekalian, kita akan memasuki acara utama kita pada hari ini, yaitu penyampaian materi webinar yang akan disampaikan oleh para narasumber. Dan nantinya akan dilanjutkan dengan sesi diskusi yang akan dipimpin oleh moderator. Izinkan saya untuk membacakan CV dari moderator kita pada hari ini. Moderator kita pada hari ini adalah Ibu Nurtina Rahma Fahriza. Beliau telah menyelesaikan pendidikan sarjana terapan akuntansi di PKN STAN, serta melanjutkan pendidikannya di bidang Master of Science di Universitas Edinburgh. Dan saat ini beliau menjabat sebagai Kepala Seksi Standarisasi Penilaian Bisnis 2 di Direktorat Penilaian DJKN Kementerian Keuangan. Selamat siang, Bu Tina.
Selamat siang, Mbak Regina.
Baik, sudah siap ya, Bu, untuk memimpin diskusi kita pada hari ini?
Ya, siap, Mbak. Ya.
Oke, siap. Baik, kami persilakan kepada Bu Nurtina sebagai moderator kita pada hari ini.
Baik, terima kasih. Saya ucapkan kembali kepada MC kita yang luar biasa, Mbak Regina, tadi atas perkenalannya ya. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat siang, Bapak, Ibu, dan seluruh peserta webinar pada hari ini. Senang sekali saya, Tina, pada hari ini diberikan kesempatan untuk memoderasi sesi pemaparan dan diskusi pada webinar kali ini ya, yang bertajuk Realizing the Value of Nature, Biodiversity Financing, and Green Tourism. Baik, Bapak Ibu, dapat saya sampaikan bahwa pada sesi utama webinar ini akan diawali dengan pemaparan materi dari masing-masing pembicara. Kemudian akan dilanjutkan dengan sesi diskusi dan tanya jawab. Nah, nanti di sela-sela pemaparan materi oleh narasumber, kami akan mengajak Bapak Ibu sekalian untuk mengisi polling bersama-sama untuk mengetahui pandangan Bapak Ibu yang hadir pada webinar kali ini terkait dengan materi yang disampaikan oleh pembicara. Jadi nanti kami mohon partisipasi aktif dari Bapak Ibu hadirin sekalian untuk dapat mengisi polling yang kami berikan. Baik, Bapak Ibu, tentunya sudah sering ya kita dengar terkait dengan natural capital atau neraca modal alam, di mana natural capital ini merupakan bagian yang ada di dalam aktivitas ekonomi selain dari SDM dan kegiatan produksi yang dihasilkan atau diukur di dalam PDB. Dan sebagai penilai di dalam aktivitas penilaian sumber daya alam hayati pun yang sudah dilaksanakan, juga kita sudah mencoba untuk mengcapture nilai-nilai atas natural capital tersebut. Kemudian di samping itu, Bapak Ibu sekalian, kita juga sering dengar ya bahwa upaya pelestarian keanekaragaman hayati ini juga menjadi perhatian ya, baik untuk menjaga nilai atau value maupun sustainability dari keanekaragaman hayati itu sendiri. Dan ini tadi juga sudah disampaikan ya oleh Bapak Alnudohong dan juga Bapak Donald Silaban dalam sambutannya. Nah, baik Bapak Ibu, untuk bisa mengetahui lebih lanjut tentang bagaimana pentingnya nilai ekonomi dari keanekaragaman hayati, serta peluang dan tantangan terkait dengan pembiayaan ya untuk kelestarian keanekaragaman hayati itu sendiri. Tanpa berlama lagi, saya akan mengundang pembicara atau speaker pertama kita yaitu Dr. Matthew Agarwala. Halo Dr. Matthew. Yeah, okay. How are you
Hello.
today? Yeah, how are you today, Dr. Matthew?
I'm sorry. One more time. I think I can hear you now.
Okay, sorry. Okay, how are you today, Dr. Matthew?
I'm very well, thank you. I'm really excited to be here.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Matthew, for being in today's webinar. It's an honor for us to have you here as speaker today. Okay, maybe I will say something to the participant today. Baik, Bapak Ibu, sebelumnya saya akan membacakan terlebih dahulu CV dari Dr. Matthew. Jadi Dr. Matthew telah menamatkan studinya di bidang Economics and Political Science di McMaster University. Dan beliau juga melanjutkan studinya di bidang Economic Policy juga di McMaster University. Kemudian beliau memperoleh gelar PhD in Environmental and Resource Economics dari the London School of Economics and Political Science. Nah, Dr. Matthew saat ini bekerja sebagai ekonomis dan peneliti dari Cambridge University. Beliau ini merupakan seorang environmental economist ya, yang memiliki interest pada pendekatan berbasis kekayaan untuk mengukur dan mewujudkan sustainable development. Nah, ini beliau juga telah melakukan berbagai penelitian dan proyek dengan fokus pada natural dan social capital. Nah, baik, tanpa berlama-lama lagi Bapak Ibu, mari kita simak bersama pemaparan dari Dr. Matthew. Okay, Dr. Matthew, maybe we will give you 15 minutes, around 15 minutes for the presentation. And without further ado, the time is yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that kind and generous introduction. Thank you so much to the organizers for the chance to be here. I've had the privilege of working with David and with Naris for a little bit over a year now, and I've met some of your brilliant ministers and vice ministers, and I think we've had a really good time together, thinking about natural capital, thinking about sustainability, thinking about finances, and how we're going to be able to mobilize funds and finance in order to achieve several of our objectives: economic growth, increasing living standards, boosting productivity, but also, of course, conserving and protecting nature and biodiversity, protecting the brilliant, globally unique ecosystems that call Indonesia their home. And there has been a very minor change to my biography in that as of the 1st of this month, I became the Bennett Chair and Professor of Sustainable Finance at the University of Sussex. So I just want to throw that in there. But without further ado, I'm going to speak to you a little bit about some of the opportunities and challenges around financing biodiversity. But before we get into it, let's go through some economic history. Over the past 100 years or so, we have seen a tremendous increase in GDP growth, and that has absolutely transformed the human condition, quality of life for people. We've seen life expectancy extended, poverty rates reduced, access to nutrition, healthcare, food, education, all of these have increased alongside GDP growth. This has seen an improvement in all parts of the world. Unequally, definitely, but improvements nonetheless. GDP growth has been good for people. The problem is that GDP growth has also released 1.5 trillion tons of CO2 into the atmosphere. It has pushed 1 million species to the brink of extinction. And in just the past 50 years, we have seen a 70% decline in wildlife populations globally. On top of this, we still have issues of inequality along multiple dimensions: income, race, gender, age. Within countries and between countries, we still have inequalities. And these three crises, the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, and the inequality crisis, threaten to wipe out a century's worth of economic gain. And it is our job to change our economic model, to change the policies, to change the way that we do business to prevent that from happening. So we need a new economic model. And the way that I like to describe that model is, imagine that you are running a bakery. The size of the pie that you can produce in the future depends on the stock of ingredients in your pantry. And if you run out of ingredients, then tomorrow's pie will be smaller. it turns out that the economy operates in exactly the same way, except that the core ingredients of economic prosperity are not sugar and eggs and butter. The core ingredients of economic prosperity are capital assets, wealth, capital assets. That includes natural capital. It includes human capital, the health and skills of the population, physical capital, the infrastructure, the roads, the buildings, the trains, the airports, social capital, the degree to which people trust in each other, in government and in business, the ability of communities to overcome collective action problems, the ability of communities to manage their natural capital and their biodiversity. And we saw that as a theme in the opening keynote. Here's how the wealth model, our economic pantry, relates to GDP growth. Essentially, it's the size of the pantry that determines the size of the future pie. GDP, or income, measures the size of our pie, but it is wealth, the combination of natural, human, social, and physical capital. That is what determines our economic pantry. In any year, you can grow your pie simply by raiding the pantry, but that is unsustainable. And what we need is an economic model that optimizes not just the size of the pie, but also the maintenance of our economic pantry. And this is the key to inclusive wealth, and this is the reason that we care about natural capital accounting. Those accounts, the measures of natural capital, are what we might use in order to measure and value and assess the contributions that nature delivers to the economy. So now it's back on you. You have a professor, you're going to get a quiz. So here's the quiz.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Dr. Matthew. I think I'm going to lead the quiz session, or do you want to
Please.
lead the quiz? Okay. Baik, sorry to interrupt your presentation. Baik, Bapak Ibu sekalian, kita memasuki untuk polling yang pertama, quiz yang pertama ya. Jadi di sini sudah kita lihat pertanyaannya. In the context of natural capital accounting, what best describe the difference between wealth and income? Jadi dalam konteks neraca modal alam, apa perbedaan antara kekayaan dan pendapatan yang paling tepat? Ini ada pilihannya. Pertama adalah kekayaan adalah jumlah total uang yang dimiliki suatu negara. Pendapatan adalah uang yang diperoleh melalui perdagangan. Kemudian kedua, kekayaan adalah aliran manfaat yang diperoleh dari sumber daya. Selama suatu periode, pendapatan adalah total stok SDA. Kemudian yang ketiga, kekayaan adalah total stok SDA pada waktu tertentu. Dan pendapatan adalah aliran manfaat dari SDA selama suatu periode. Yang terakhir, tidak ada perbedaan nyata antara kekayaan dan pendapatan dalam akuntansi modal alam. Baik, kami akan memberikan waktu sebentar lagi. Ini sudah ada 42% ya partisipan yang sudah mengisi. Kita menunggu sebentar lagi, mungkin sekitar 60%. Selanjutnya akan kita tutup pollingnya. Kalau sudah banyak, silahkan Bapak Ibu yang berpartisipasi untuk mengisi polling.
Well,
Baik,
I think
okay.
this is great. In the interest of time, I'd like to move forward.
Okay.
What I'm really excited to see is that more than half of the participants have engaged. So at least they're still awake. Almost all of them, 80%, have gotten this one correct. That wealth is the stock at a given time, but that ecosystem services reflect the income, right? So it's capital, which is the stock that provides a flow of income over time. That's an excellent ratio, 80% getting this right. I'm very proud of you. Either I'm a brilliant professor or you are already too clever for me. But thank you for engaging with that poll. So if I move on, let's think about how do we actually generate finance or funding for biodiversity. And the fact is that we face an uphill battle. We have been here before. You may remember the Aichi targets, which were supposed to be the global framework for helping protect and conserve biodiversity. There were 20 targets, and none of them really were met on the global scale. And it's not for a lack of interest. It's not because we didn't have the experts. It's not because people don't care. Biodiversity is just very difficult to finance and to fund. It requires smart policies. It requires changes in law. It requires a collective will. It requires sound leadership. And the finance gap is substantial. The global framework on biodiversity indicates that we're talking around 700 billion US dollars is needed every year between now and 2030 to reverse the trend in biodiversity loss. Research by the World Bank indicates that the annual loss of GDP associated with biodiversity loss could be as much as 2.7 trillion by 2030. Now, you don't have to be the deputy finance minister. You don't have to have a PhD in economics. Would you pay 700 billion to save 2.7 trillion? Ideally, the answer would be yes, we should make that trade. So let's think about how we actually do that. What I'm showing you here is a map of biodiversity hotspots in the world. You can see Indonesia very well represented. Now I'm going to lay on top of that a map of the financial hotspots of the world. And one of the challenges here that we see is that money tends to live where biodiversity does not. They're in different parts of the world, which means the capital markets, the big banks, the financiers, the financial expertise is in New York and in London, and it's not in Bali and in Jakarta. And this is a challenge because the laws that exist in New York are there to protect New York's assets. They are not there to protect Bali or Jakarta or Indonesia's assets at large. And this is why I was so impressed to see the statements about common but differentiated responsibilities from our opening keynote. I think that was really important. What we see on this slide is essentially a global subsidy from the countries with lots of biodiversity to these financial hotspots. Lower income, biodiversity-rich countries are giving a subsidy to higher income, finance-rich countries because our entire economy depends on these global biodiversity assets. That's backwards. What we need is for financial flows to correct this inequality, where the lower income, biodiversity-rich countries are paying essentially the wealthier countries. So what do we do about actually monetizing this? Where does the real challenge come? We're trying to have dollars flowing to protect biodiversity. Well, one of the challenges, one of the reasons biodiversity is so hard to finance is that the benefits that we get from biodiversity are called public goods. They benefit people at large, but it is very difficult for me to capture the financial benefit. They benefit the public. They are things like a healthier ecosystem, more sort of richer oceans, more food in the ocean. It's very difficult for me as an individual to capture the whole benefit from a healthier ocean. And so I'm going to underinvest in that ecosystem. It means that we have a coordination failure where not all of the actors are working together. We have a free rider problem where individuals will say, well, if Indonesia protects its biodiversity, why do I have to protect mine? We've already got rainforest, we've already got tropical ecosystems, we've already got brilliant coral reefs. I don't need to protect mine if Indonesia protects theirs. But there are some ways that private finance can be interested and deliver financial flows for ecosystems and biodiversity. The most important opportunities here are where there is a co-benefit, where there is a link between market goods and services and public goods of biodiversity. So what's a concrete example of this? Well, if scuba diving is a market good or service, I can create a scuba diving tourism company, I can have a hotel, I can buy the boats, I can hire the staff, I can have my own company, but it depends on the public good of the healthy coral reef. Then I might be willing to use some of my company's funds in order to help protect that coral reef, because I get a financial return from my business. I'm not getting directly a financial return from the coral reef, but because the coral reef is there and healthy, I am getting a financial return from my tourism business. That's the way that private finance will be able to deliver money in pursuit of ecosystem conservation. So it works when we have ecotourism. It works when we have trophy hunting. It works where we think that the value of land might increase because of healthier biodiversity. The problem with these is that these sorts of opportunities tend to be small scale. They will protect a few miles of coral reef. They might protect a few square kilometers of rainforest. If people are going to go into the mountains, into the rainforest looking for birds or orangutans or elephants or whatever. A small range will be protected, but they will not protect global biodiversity hotspots at large because the financial returns can't be captured by the individual business. And what that means is that however much we expect private finance to help us, the real backstop here is going to be the public sector. It's going to be government. It must be. It can only be government. This means public subsidies for conservation. It means strict regulation and banning environmentally harmful activities. It means taxes and auctions. It means debt for nature swaps. It also means ending environmentally harmful subsidies. That doesn't require any new revenue. It just means we have to shift our subsidies from things that are bad for nature towards things that are good for nature. So we have another quiz. I'll hand back to our moderator for the quiz.
Oke, thank you, Dr. Matthew. Baik, Bapak Ibu sekalian, saya akan mandu lagi untuk kuis yang kedua, atau paling kedua, yaitu sudah terlihat pertanyaannya, what do you think is the current biggest challenge in mobilizing finance to conserve biodiversity in Indonesia? Menurut Anda, apa tantangan terbesar saat ini dalam upaya pembiayaan untuk melestarikan keanekaragaman hayati di Indonesia? Baik, saya akan berikan waktu kurang lebih 1 menit untuk paling ini. Saat ini sudah ada sekitar 14% yang sudah mengisi polling. Baik, kami tunggu sebentar lagi Bapak Ibu. Silahkan untuk dapat mengisi polling. Oke, kita akan end poll ya, karena sudah habis waktunya dan kita coba lihat hasilnya seperti apa. Sudah ada sekitar 45% yang responden yang mengisi polling pada hari ini dan sekitar 72% menjawab jawaban utama yaitu meningkatkan kesadaran publik yang terbatas tentang nilai keanekaragaman hayati menyebabkan kurangnya kemampuan politik untuk meningkatkan pendanaan dan menarik investasi. Ya, itu jawaban yang benar dan 72% yang menjawab. Oke, Dr. Matthew, I will give the floor back to you to proceed with the presentation.
There
Okay,
isn't
thank you.
one correct or wrong answer to this particular quiz. I'm sorry, that might have been an unfair trick. Actually, all of these are really important challenges that we need to overcome. Yes, increasing awareness, but I think from an economist's view, one of the real big issues we need to deal with is the transaction costs. What do I mean by transaction costs? Well, if I want to demonstrate that my farm is protecting biodiversity, and so you should pay me more for my farm products because there is a green, environmentally friendly premium. I have to prove to you that my farm is actually better for nature than the other farms. And in order to do that, I have to go out and develop some measures. I have to collect the data. I have to compile the data. I have to put it into a spreadsheet. I have to make figures and graphs and convince you. I have to get you to give me your time to convince you. All of this takes time and effort and money. It's a cost. And the longer it takes and the more expensive it is to do this, the harder it is to obtain that green premium. If I'm only going to get 5% more for my products because they're environmentally friendly, but it costs me 7% of the sale price in order to deliver the information to prove it, it's not worth it for me. So this is where natural capital accounting, this is where AI tools for ecosystem monitoring, this is where really good on-the-ground measures and good models of ecosystem services can really reduce the transaction costs and can therefore increase the capacity for private finance to deliver for nature. Now, one of the things I want to go through very quickly, I'm going to push through this slide pretty quickly, is that everybody seems to want to blame somebody else for the environmental challenges. Governments often want to say, it's not us, it's businesses and consumers that are not delivering for nature. But the public says, I'm just one person. I'm not that big. All I can do is, change little habits. What really needs to happen is governments and businesses need to change. Businesses, on their part, say, look, we are just fulfilling the demands of the public. We're meeting consumer demand, and we're following the laws that government set. If you don't like the laws, change the government. And if you don't like the public, they have to change what they buy. As long as we are pushing the blame, I don't think we're going to find a solution here. And the fact is, whilst we're playing that blame game of pointing fingers, somebody else is always paying. It might be that the farmers pay because their land is degraded or their products aren't selling for a high enough price. If it's not the farmers that pay, it might be the big companies that pay. If there's stricter regulation, they may lose profit. If it's not the farmers or the big companies, it might be the public, the consumers. We may face higher food prices, higher house prices, higher transport prices, etc. And if it's not the public through their consumption, it might be the public through taxes, if we have to pay environmental taxes, etc. And if it's none of these, if it's not the farmers, it's not the businesses, not the consumers, and not the taxpayers, then I can promise you the people who will pay are future generations. It's the earth itself that pays. We raid the pantry. Now, there are lots of different ways that we can decide who pays. One of the things that we know is that somebody always pays. It is policy that lets us decide who pays. Now, in most instances, when it comes to environment, people prefer the idea of the polluter pays. If I'm the one that degrades nature, I should have to pay for that. And the policies associated with this are really taxes and fines, punishments for environmental degradation. But the fact is that the vast majority of economic transactions that you and I will ever take place in, it's the beneficiary that pays. I benefit from this pen, from this coffee, from that computer. Because I benefit, I have to pay for it. If I benefit from nature, from clean air, healthy rivers, healthy ecosystems, then I should have to pay for those. And the way that happens is generally through public taxation. I benefit from national defense. I benefit from roads. I benefit from a healthy government, from education. And so we pay for those through taxes. The principle that we would want to pursue is that we get the greatest net benefit. Whatever policies and whoever we're choosing is going to face the bill, we should try to get the greatest net benefit, the most environmental benefit for our dollars. But what does the evidence actually tell us? Well, there are a couple of different ways that I like to think about finance and funding for nature. And the first thing is that we must distinguish between finance and funding. If you listen to only one thing from my talk, please let it be this. Finance requires a return to the investor. I will not give you finance unless I think I'm getting a return. We've spoken about biodiversity being a public good and the benefits being public goods and how difficult it is to deliver and capture a financial return on a public good. Okay, that's finance. There is another way that we can mobilize money for biodiversity, and that is funding. Funding does not require a return to the investor. When we give a grant to a student to do a PhD, they don't have to pay that back, they get a grant. When we give a charitable donation, the charity doesn't have to pay that back with interest, it's funding. These two are very different. Funding has been the primary source of delivering money for nature. If you want to unlock private finance, then you have to demonstrate a way that the investor will get a return. So let's think about the sources of money. And on the horizontal axis here, I have public money, which is more funding oriented, and I have private money, which is more finance oriented. Governments can provide funding, and private sector can provide some finance. On the vertical axis, I'm thinking about voluntary activities versus compliance, regulated, mandatory activities. So if we look at where we lie on this quadrant, private voluntary activities would be things like offsets, ecotourism, trophy hunting, investing in land where we think it's going to have an increase in value because of biodiversity. It can be targeted towards biodiversity gain, and we can expect there to be some financial returns. But it tends to be pretty small in geographic scope and in terms of global impact. And it tends to be pretty small volumes of money. If instead we think about public voluntary activities, these are things like debt for nature swaps, green bonds, payments for ecosystem services, repurposed subsidies that provide environmental benefits. There's pretty strong potential for biodiversity gain and for global impact. But there's mixed evidence about the amount of money that's actually going to be delivered and the expected financial returns. And it tends not to be very high on the political priority list, although that varies across countries. If we think about private compliance, this is where governments regulate such that the private sector has no choice. That is, charging taxes, imposing permit schemes, offsets, increasing legal liability for environmental destruction. These things, private compliance, I think have great potential for biodiversity gain and global impact. Good potential for economic returns, but not so much for financial returns. But the problem is there's not very much activity going on in this quadrant, so the evidence base is a bit small. And finally, I think I'm going to end on this slide simply because we're running out of time. If we think about public compliance, these are infrastructure standards, putting rules in trade agreements about how goods might affect nature. We won't take illegal timber, for instance. We won't take illegal fishing, for instance. International treaties, tying foreign aid to environmental outcomes. These things, I think, have tremendous possibility in terms of the global impact, the volume of money, and the potential biodiversity gain. But they suffer because it's not always the political priority. When you're negotiating a new trade deal, it's usually not because you want environmental outcomes, it's usually because you want economic outcomes. It's difficult to enforce these sorts of standards and trade agreements and international treaties across borders. And so the coordination challenge becomes all the more important. I think in the interest of time, I should probably stop here, though I'm happy to take questions in due course at the appropriate time. So if I could hand back, please, to the moderator.
Okay, thank you, Matthew. Maybe I think we still have 5 minutes for the presentation.
Okay. If I've still got 5 minutes, then let's go with this question. So I think the question is here. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Baik, untuk pertanyaan ketiga, Bapak Ibu sekalian, apa saja peluang dalam memobilisasi pendanaan konservasi keanekaragaman hayati? Baik, kami juga memberikan waktu kurang lebih 1 menit untuk polling. Ya, sekarang sudah ada 28% yang sudah berpartisipasi. Silahkan Bapak Ibu yang belum mengisi polling itu dapat segera mengisikan pollingnya. Baik, bisa kita end poll. Ini sudah ada 43% yang berpartisipasi dalam polling, di mana untuk mayoritas responden memilih semua pilihan di atas, sekitar 78% memilih jawaban D ya, semua pilihan di atas. Baik, then I will give back to you, Matthew, for the presentation. Also maybe a response from the polling. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. That is absolutely the correct answer. All of these are key opportunities for mobilizing finance. Sorry, I just need to change this. So if I do have just a couple of minutes left, then I think what I'm going to do is go back to a couple of slides that I skipped. So here's the one that I think sums up the presentation the best. What are the best practices for mobilizing private finance in order to pursue biodiversity and environmental gains? Well, the first thing is to try to tie the public goods associated with biodiversity to market goods and services. So ecotourism, I think it's a tremendous opportunity for Indonesia. Trophy hunting is politically controversial, but it is a way of generating funds if it is well managed. I think another major concern is the stability of the policies and the political system. This is not just an issue in Indonesia. This is an issue everywhere. It is especially an issue here in the United Kingdom, where policy flip-flopping around biodiversity credits and carbon offsets, these sorts of things, has made it very difficult for people to invest. This is a challenge all over the world. But the more stable the policies can be, the more consistent they can be, the greater trust that businesses and people have in the government and its ability to enact environmental policies for things like biodiversity credits or carbon markets. The more stability we have, the more successful these markets can be, and the more funds they can generate. They need to be credible and stable. We need to have the evidence base. You need the natural capital accounts. And that is the final thing here. We must invest not just in nature, but in all of the complementary assets as well. That means the infrastructure, including the statistical infrastructure, but it also means we have to invest in the skills and the regulation. And that's why, for me, it is such a privilege and an honor to be part of this brilliant Sekolah Valuasi. And I apologize for my pronunciation, but this is really exciting for me. I'm especially grateful to the organizers, to the ministers who've spoken. It's great to see, first of all, that you have political leaders with PhDs That's something very exciting to me. But also to see just policymakers who are so excited and engaged in this sort of material. And I'd like to thank David and Naris, who was my student in Cambridge before I started working with her on this. Thank you so much for the chance to be here.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Matthew, for the insightful presentation on biodiversity financing. We could get the information from the new economic model and then the economic challenge in monetizing biodiversity, and also the evidence on biodiversity financing itself, including the best practices and also the obstacles that we might face. Okay, baik.
Mbak Tina, mute Mbak Tina.
Okay, sorry, I think I still, turned off my microphone. Okay, thank you again, Dr. Matthew, for the insightful presentation on the biodiversity financing. We can get information from starting from the economic models, and then the economic challenge in monetizing biodiversity, and also the evidence on biodiversity financing, including its best practices and also the obstacles that we may face. Baik, Bapak Ibu sekalian yang kami hormati, sebelum kita memasuki sesi pemaparan yang kedua, mari bersama-sama kita saksikan video. Baik, ini video terkait dengan materi yang akan disampaikan oleh speaker kita yang kedua. Mungkin rekan-rekan panitia bisa membantu untuk memutarkan videonya. Ya, baik, mungkin ada sedikit kendala dalam pemutaran video. Bisa dibantu dari rekan-rekan panitia? Baik, Bapak Ibu sekalian, sesuai dengan apa yang sudah kita saksikan pada video tadi, untuk tema selanjutnya pada webinar kali ini terkait dengan nature-based tourism atau pariwisata berbasis alam atau yang kita kenal juga dengan istilah green tourism. Ya, untuk mengetahui lebih lanjut tentang bagaimana implementasi investasi biodiversity dalam nature-based tourism, tanpa berlama lagi saya akan mengundang pembicara kita yang kedua, yaitu Dr. Maurice Andres Rollins. Hello, Dr. Maurice. Good afternoon.
Hi, good afternoon.
Okay, how are you today, Dr. Maurice?
I am doing well, thank you. And you?
I'm fine too, thank you. Okay, thank you, Dr. Maurice, for being seen to this webinar. It's also such an honor to have you here as speaker today. Baik, sebelumnya Bapak Ibu, saya akan menyampaikan CV dari Dr. Maurice. Jadi Dr. Maurice ini telah menamatkan studinya di bidang Environmental and Natural Resource Management di University of the West Indies. Kemudian beliau melanjutkan studinya di bidang Environmental Change and Management di University of Oxford. Dan beliau juga telah memperoleh gelar PhD in Environmental Biology or Ecosystem Modeling di University of West Indies. Dan Dr. Maurice saat ini bekerja sebagai Senior Environmental Specialist di World Bank. Beliau telah memiliki pengalaman lebih dari 10 tahun dalam project management dan policy and strategy development dengan expertise dalam natural resources management serta climate change. Baiklah, tanpa berlama-lama lagi, Bapak Ibu, mari kita simak bersama pemaparan dari Dr. Maurice. Okay, Dr. Maurice, we will give you around 15 minutes for the presentation. So without further ado, the time is yours.
Okay, excellent. So, good afternoon, distinguished guests, representatives of the various ministries, and then, of course, to the participants of this webinar. It's indeed a pleasure to be joining you this afternoon to speak on this topic, and I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting us to present on the experience of the Lao PDR as we finance biodiversity as part of forest management programs. So this afternoon, I will present very briefly on the Lao Landscapes and Livelihoods project, what we call the LLL or Triple L project, explaining the design of it and then talking about some of the results and the lessons that we learned so far from its implementation. Okay, so the LLL project really has three key objectives to it. The first objective is about promoting sustainable forest management. The second objective is on improving protected areas management, and the third objective on enhancing livelihood opportunities. And all of these objectives are done across selected landscapes in Lao PDR. And this was a really important design aspect for the government here, and in fact it's an innovation in the way that they have done projects of this type before, because traditionally the government sort of managed different forest categories in silos. So you had production forest where you do natural forest harvesting separately from protected areas, which traditionally focuses on biodiversity, and then protection forest, which focuses more on watersheds. And so now you have this landscape approach, which is bringing together the management of all of these forest categories sort of under one roof. And it was also a new step for the bank in Laos. We hadn't done this kind of landscape approach before. Previously, we supported the various forest categories with specific projects. And so there were quite a lot of lessons that we needed to learn as well as we implemented this. And that video that you saw at the start of the presentation was one of the early things that we had to do, because the landscape approach is not something that exists within Lao vocabulary. And so we needed to find a way to introduce the terminology and introduce the interpretation and meaning of what it meant. So we had the video as one of those tools that we use to better explain the concept. And so the project is financed through what many of you may be familiar with as IPF. So it's sort of traditional project financing. And so the project is being financed from three sources. So we have from the World Bank IDA credit, 34 million, from the Global Environmental Facility, a grant of 7.4 million. And then we have an additional credit from the Canadian Clean Energy and Forest Climate Facility of 16 million. So total of about 57.4 million for this project. And we started the implementation in May of 2021, and we will go until September 2027. And so we're just at about the midpoint of the project. We're starting to see some results, and we're also starting to learn some lessons as well from its implementation. So just to say a bit more about the project, so there are 5 landscapes over which the project is implemented, and you can see the map that's on the right. Those colored areas are the 5 different landscapes, and these landscapes comprise protected areas, they comprise protection forest, and also production forest. And each of these landscapes have been defined not just as areas where these 3 forests exist together, but where there are similar characteristics across the landscape. So, for example, one of the landscapes is identified as a biodiversity complex that connects not only biodiversity in Laos, but also biodiversity in neighboring Vietnam. Then you have one of the landscapes that it's more mountainous, that sort of thing. So there are these sort of biophysical and also socioeconomic and cultural characteristics to the landscapes as well. Village forest exists in all of these national forest categories. And so it was really quite important that the objective of livelihood development became one of the top objectives of the project, realizing that that because there is such a high proportion of people that live within forests, it was really quite important that as we try to improve forest management, we also look at improving the way how people engage in livelihood activities, engage in income earning activities within those forest areas. And so having resources for that was really quite important. And so the project is touching about 72,000 households and about 400,000 people. In terms of results, we have a results framework that has about 11 indicators, and 4 of the important results indicators are shown on the screen. So relating to sustainable forest management, we have a result that's expected that forest cover across the landscapes would be maintained or increased. For the result relating to improved protected areas management, we use a tool called the Management Effectiveness Tracking Tool, and it's a tool that has been around for quite some time that helps us to understand how management of protected areas is being improved or going in the opposite direction over time. And so we use this as an indicator. In terms of livelihoods, we also look at the number of households or economic interest groups. And so these may include farmers groups, women, textile groups that are engaged in alternative or improved traditional livelihood activities supported by the project. And then as well, we count the total number of beneficiaries, so direct and also indirect beneficiaries of the project, of forest management activities, and then also the job and income-focused project interventions. Okay, and so in terms of the project area, these are just some images of what the Lao landscape looks like. And so on the left is a forest and agricultural landscape in one of the provinces in Khammouane province. And then on the right, it shows one of the nature-based tourism infrastructure that's part of the protected areas within the landscape area. And so what are we financing? So the activities that are being financed are organized into 3 main components. The overall project has 4 components, but these 3 are the important ones for this discussion. And so the first component is called investing in natural wealth and resilience in forest landscapes. And so consistent with this idea that Laos has important natural capital and that projects such as this one are really the government's investments in protecting and also transforming that natural capital. And so here we finance protected area activities that include things like protected area management planning, zoning, boundary demarcation, ranger patrolling, some amount of infrastructure within protected areas, things like protected area headquarters, ranger stations, that sort of thing, right? So really building up the capacity and also the goods, equipment, and infrastructure that are needed for adequately managing protected areas. And then we also have nature-based tourism. And so this nature-based tourism is done with a focus on enhancing or building the enabling environment for private sector investment in tourism in protected areas. And so there are a number of key activities. So under this component, we support the development of protected area tourism prospectuses, right? And so this is a prospectus for private sector investors that show all of the assets in the tourism in the protected area, where investors can look to invest, different zones, that sort of thing. And we also finance a small amount of a small scale tourism infrastructure within some of these protected areas. Under this component, we also finance forest management planning for production forest and protection forest areas, and we support villages with small-scale resilient village infrastructure. And so the idea of this is that it's meant to be a complement to the livelihood development, where we finance things like upgrading of small-scale irrigation, upgrading of roads, that sort of thing, with the intention that they help to enhance livelihoods. They are designed in a resilient way against the impacts of climate change, etc. The second component is called livelihood opportunities from sustainable forest landscapes. And so under this component, we have financing that goes directly to villages, and it goes in the form of livelihood block grants. And these are organized at the village level as revolving funds, right? And so the revolving funds are something that we've done before. And so typically there would be a positive list and a negative list, right? Positive list being the things that we encourage the villagers to use resources from the revolving fund for, and then the negative list would be the things that that are not aligned with sustainable forest management. And so accompanying the process of the grants is a whole long process of community engagement that includes community action planning, land use zoning, and all that sort of thing. So there's quite a bit of intervention that goes in before communities receive this money in hand. We have another block of activities that focus on vocational training and skills development. And so this is really meant to be a complement to the livelihood grants development, recognizing that there are forest enterprises, plantation enterprises, etc., where people need to be skilled up, but also recognizing that that there could be skills development in non-forest activities that would help to reduce pressure on the forest. And so this is the scope of these activities. And then we also have under this component a matching grants facility, where we provide grants to a private sector for developing nature-based tourism, right? And so it's called a business leveraging facility. And so this is something that we're working on as well. The third component is called institutions, incentives, and information. And so here we have a variety of activities. The first on strengthening institutions and policies. And so under this block of activities, we work on things like activities for enabling plantation development. We work on tourism policy for enhancing for enabling private sector investment in protected areas, and other types of policies that are relevant for landscape management. And quite importantly as well, we have a dedicated budget line for coordination of the different actors that are needed under the landscape approach. We also finance forest forest law and wildlife law enforcement, right? And so this includes providing resources to law enforcement agencies that allow them to undertake planning, monitoring, rapid response against forest and wildlife crimes. And we also use a number of satellite-based monitoring tools to monitor deforestation and then also illegal logging. And then we have a third category of activities where we support things like impact analysis for the landscape projects. We also have an activity here that's focused on valuation of ecosystem services within the forest landscape, and then we also focus on greenhouse gas accounting and really understanding how the project is contributing to Laos's NDC commitments. So again, some images of project activities. On the left is a women's group that we supported in a previous project to do weaving and to enhance their weaving business. And so they've been able to upscale this with equipment, with advertising, that sort of thing. On the right are two infrastructure that we would support, and they are at very early stages in terms of the work, right? But this is the kind of thing that we finance as part of the project within the forest area. And as many of you would appreciate, within a landscape, there are several different actors that need to be coordinated. And so the implementing arrangements had to be studied really quite carefully, right? Because we needed to find a way to effectively bring together all of these actors within a framework, but not having it be too complex and complicated that the government couldn't implement it. And so what we really focused on was looking at existing structures that were in place, right? So existing committees, existing task forces, and really building on those as opposed to introducing new things that would require substantive effort in terms of getting them set up, and then in terms of pulling the government away from the things that they need to be focused on. And so in this project, we
I'm
have...
sorry, Dr.
Yes.
Morris, for interrupting. We only have like 1 more minute for the presentation. Maybe we can
All right,
move
good.
forward. Thank you.
No problem. So I'll jump ahead from this implementing arrangements slide. I think you'll have access to the slides, and so you can study it in some detail. But let me talk about some lessons from implementing the LLL project. And so there are 3 things I want to emphasize. So the first one is something that I mentioned before, that income generating activities really need to be done at the same time as we're doing these traditional forest management activities. And again, because people live within the forest, and we cannot not tend to the needs of people as we tend to the needs of improving forest management. And so there are a number of income generating activities, nature-based tourism, commercial plantations development, forest livelihoods that have been built into the project. The second is a point I mentioned before with respect to the coordination. And what was really quite important was to actually build in resources for coordination, and not expected that it will happen for free under the project. We also, in some cases, needed to develop policies for coordination. So for example, on nature-based tourism development, a new policy that would see coordination between Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry, and then also the Ministry of Tourism. And then the third one was really making clear the incentives for the Department of Forestry to engage in income activities like nature-based tourism, which was something that was not traditionally within their mandate. And so how we did this was to really provide the evidence of how the Department of Forestry would benefit from well-planned investments in nature-based tourism. And so among these were the revenues that would come from nature-based tourism that can flow back into supporting forest protection, using nature-based tourism as an opportunity to create direct and indirect sources of revenues for forest communities, and then having that as an incentive for the forest communities engaging more and better in forest protection. And then the third one was around really helping to manage the uncontrolled and unplanned development of tourism in protected areas, which we have seen in Laos and we've seen in several other countries. And so having the government take an active role in protected area zoning, really advising on where tourism should be developed, is something that actually helps the ministry to better do what they need to do. So I'll stop here, and I'll be available to answer any questions that there may be on the project. Back to you, Natina.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Maris, for the insightful presentation. So we can already had the information about the nature-based tourism from the experience of Lao Landscape Livelihood Project, like from the project explanation and then including the project financing, project component and activities, and also the project implementing arrangement. And we can already have the insightful presentation about the lesson that we can get from the implementing of the project. Oke, baik Bapak Ibu yang kami hormati, tadi kita sudah menyimak bersama pemaparan dari dua pembicara kita, yaitu Dr. Matthew maupun Dr. Morris, terkait dengan pembiayaan keanekaragaman hayati serta contoh praktik terkait dengan nature-based tourism yang ada di negara Laos. Kemudian memasuki sesi selanjutnya, Bapak Ibu yang kami hormati, saya ingin mengundang Bapak Ibu sekalian yang memiliki pertanyaan dan juga tanggapan atas materi yang sudah diberikan baik oleh Dr. Matthew dan juga Dr. Morris. Jadi Bapak Ibu dapat menggunakan fitur raise hand ataupun menuliskan pertanyaan di kolom chat. Dan jangan lupa saat menyampaikan pertanyaan tersebut, Bapak Ibu dapat menuliskan nama dan juga asal instansinya, dan juga pertanyaannya ditujukan untuk siapa, apakah untuk Dr. Matthew atau untuk Dr. Morris. Ya, nanti kami untuk kesempatan pertama akan memberikan kesempatan kepada dua penanya terlebih dahulu. Nanti untuk selanjutnya dijawab oleh pembicara kita. Jadi apabila masih ada waktu, kita akan memberikan kesempatan yang untuk penanya selanjutnya. Baik, kami persilahkan Bapak Ibu sekalian.
Come in to respond, or you want to take a few different questions?
I'm gonna get a question first. Oke, yang pertama saya akan berikan kesempatan. Sudah ada Bapak Jerry Falson yang resen. Silahkan Bapak Jerry.
Okay, thanks for the opportunity. My question relate to, I'm interested in the Maurice explanation, and I would like to would you please to tell us a little bit more about the income multipliers in it when we put the tourism sectors at the conservation areas. Do we have any considerations in jobs support for the people at that area, at the particular area at Lao? Maybe that's it. Thanks, Morris.
Oke, thank you for the question, Bapak Jerry Falson. Baik, mungkin saya akan membacakan untuk pertanyaan kedua, untuk selanjutnya dijawab secara langsung oleh Dr. Chris. Di sini ada pertanyaan dari Haruno Nur Sasongko dari PT Bumi Sukses Indo. Ini ditujukan juga untuk Dr. Morris. So the question is, it is very challenging to involve every stakeholder to achieve this aim. The question are, how long you built this project, and then what is the biggest challenge to achieve this aim? Okay, I would like to invite Dr. Morris to respond for the first and the second question.
Okay, sure. All right. Thank you. So in terms of the tourism, so let me start with that. So we did some analytical work prior to the project that helped us to understand the potential for the growth of tourism in Laos. And so from that work, we were able to assess that there was an income multiplier. And I don't have the number off the top of my head, but I'm remembering the number 1.4 from tourism investments, and I can just put a link to the study in the chat at a later point. And so what's really quite important in terms of the design of the project is that while we're focused on really enhancing private sector investment in tourism, we do not forget the communities that are part of that tourism ecosystem. And so we do have some activities that are part of the matching grant requirement, that these private sector need to have some sort of relationship with communities, right? And so this relationship could look like the communities will provide some labor for the private sector enterprise, or the farming areas within the communities could help to provide food for the tourism enterprise, that sort of thing. And so the sort of the relationships between the private sector and the community need to be worked out. But quite importantly, there is an agreement that will be established between the two to ensure that that there could be that flow of benefits. And then complementary to that, we do have, as I mentioned in the presentation, some buckets of finance, one under vocational skills and training. And so we do expect that communities would be able to take up these resources and do things like tourism training, that as part of the livelihood development grants as well, that communities can access these to invest in tourism. So that's kind of how that's taken care of. On the question with respect to how long it took to develop the project, so sorry, we had a project preparation of about 2 years. Unfortunately, it coincided with COVID. And so this made the project preparation a little bit challenging in terms of going out to project sites and being able to consult and collect information, etc. But it was about 2 years that we took. And in terms of the biggest challenge, I would say, and the challenge that we continue to face even in implementation, is really around coordination, right? And so within this landscape, there are a number of sort of horizontal players that need to be coordinated. So all of the different teams and divisions that work on different things, so tourism, non-timber forest products, livelihoods, forest management, all of these teams need to be coordinated. And then you have this vertical coordination that's needed between the provincial, district, and the village. And so this took us quite some time, I would say, to get right. I think we're still working on it, but what was really quite important is to ensure that we built in sufficient resources that would allow for that would support this coordination, basically. So I'll stop there on the response.
Okay, thank you,
Thanks.
Dr. Morris, for the response. For Pak Jerry Falson and Pak Haruno, is there any follow-up on that?
Very nice.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Morris, and also Pak Jerry Falson and Pak Haruno. Okay, moving on to the next question. We have question from the Slido for Dr. Morris. So, what is the impact from the project achievement in Laos to the economic and social growth for the people around this project?
Right. So we're still in the process of, or we're still sort of getting there to be able to measure the economic impact. And so what we've done so far, we've started the distribution of the livelihood development grants. We started the training, and so several things are happening at the same time. But I expect that we will only be able to really measure the results in terms of job creation, in terms of changes in income, really in later years. I would say in 2026 and 2027 is when we would be able to see those results. So I think right now, but let me also reflect, just as I have the floor, we did a similar sort of arrangement in a previous project, where we provided these grants, as a complement to forest management activities, and we found that that there have been successes. It hasn't been across the board success. There were some things that didn't work out, but we found there were successes, particularly with organized groups, right? And so I mentioned that that women's weaver group, right? And so they were able to take this relatively small grant of about $10,000 and really invest in particularly marketing for their products, and then also improving the equipment, and as well making these connections between the provincial towns and then the capital city, right? And so that was a really quite important step for them, because they had the skills already in weaving, right? We couldn't tell them anything about that, but what they needed was skills in marketing and really being able to upscale their production. So I'll stop here.
Okay, thank you, Maris, for the response. Is there any question from the participant here? Baik, apabila tidak ada pertanyaan, mungkin saya ingin menanyakan kepada Dr. Matthew terkait dengan presentasinya yang sudah disampaikan. So, my question is, we know that by implementing having a point of view of the biodiversity itself, we know that we still see biodiversity financing or biodiversity economic or something else that besides what we do in our daily activities, right? But you know, to protect the biodiversity, we have to, as a society and also as a government, we have to put that biodiversity point of view to our policy and our daily activities. But in the what already have done before, is there any like a contradiction from the policy that have been made in the government itself between one institution to another? Maybe because we need to have a lot of many policy that will be make a synergy to make a good policy in the biodiversity itself. So maybe in the point of view of from the policymaker itself, is there any other contradiction that already happened on that? Thank you.
Yeah, so there are lots of trade-offs involved. Sometimes doing the right thing for carbon policy entails doing the wrong thing for water or biodiversity policy. For instance, if you move to producing crops to produce biofuels, this could lead to accelerated deforestation, exacerbated stress on water and water pollution as a result of agricultural land use change. And it might do something beneficial for carbon, but it turns out to do something terrible for biodiversity or for water. Absolutely, there are trade-offs, no question. And it's not just trade-offs within environmental policy, carbon versus biodiversity policies, but there are also trade-offs between different government objectives. Infrastructure development and ecosystem connectivity can sometimes come into a conflict. There is no sense trying to pretend that these conflicts, that these contradictions, the trade-offs don't exist. It would be a lie to tell you that your policies are always going to be a win-win. Not going to happen. What I think we can do, though, is if we develop the natural capital accounts and the physical accounts and the social capital accounts and the human capital accounts, and we use those as a guide to evaluating policies before they're implemented so that we can decide which policies to pursue, and then to evaluate them again after they're implemented so that we can monitor what the impacts are. Then we won't get rid of the trade-offs, but we will at least be able to identify them, to quantify them and measure them, and to make those trade-offs in a deliberate and consistent manner. Until we have the accounts, until we have that information, unless we do the monitoring, we will still face the trade-offs. We just won't be able to say anything concrete about them in an empirical sense. So I think the evidence-based, those accounts are really very important. Now, of course, we should always look for the win-win policy, the thing that, the policy that sequesters carbon and enhances biodiversity and gives you economic growth and gives you better infrastructure. And when these exist, absolutely pursue them. So one of the tools that we use in economic planning is what we call robust decision-making. We take a look at what policies we would pursue if our goal was simply income growth. And we take a look at what we might do if our goal was simply maximizing biodiversity conservation. And we take a look at those two policies and see if there's any overlap. Are there activities that you would pursue under both optimization regimes? And if so, then you know that those activities at least are going to be safe. There's actually very limited evidence about these sorts of trade-offs. But the evidence that we do have comes from the United States, and it shows that if you optimize for economic values, ecosystem service flows, you tend to get about 50 to 60% of the biodiversity benefits. If you optimize for biodiversity benefits, you tend to get about 40 to 50% of the ecosystem service values. So yes, there will be trade-offs, but there will also be co-benefits. And the final thing that I should say, it's not purely biodiversity related, but it is absolutely the biggest opportunity for co-benefits between environmental policy and economic policy. That is to fix air pollution. Air pollution has a major detrimental effect on human capital, on health, and on productivity. If you can address air pollution by reducing the emissions intensity of vehicles, reducing the emissions intensity of building heating, then you can have a major gain, not just in your carbon accounts, but also in your human capital side.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Matthew, for the explanation. It's quite interesting. Okay, we have here Martina Dewi Hanini, who already raised her hand. Okay, the next opportunity for the question I will give to Ibu Martina.
Thank you. I will have a question for Dr. Matthew. Thank you for your comprehensive presentation. So my question, on your presentation, you mentioned about biodiversity public goods. Can you hear me? Sorry. Yeah. So you mentioned about tie biodiversity public goods to market goods and services as one of the best practice for private finance. And you also touch a bit about the ecotourism. However, we also understand that there are also a challenge for ecotourism itself, mostly about the planning and appropriate management. And most of the time, we notice that cause the destruction of local resources. So my question is how to ensure that when we tie biodiversity public goods to market goods and services is done in a sustainable manner. I think that's my question. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. And this is where one of those trade-offs comes into play. The reality is that if you want a booming ecotourism industry, then you are going to need luxury hotels, mid-rate hotels, and budget hotels. You're going to need roads for people to get access to the ecosystem. You're going to need toilet facilities, shopping facilities, etc. All of these things are going to need to be there on hand. The good news, however, and all of these things entail environmental damage, right? You're clear cutting in order to put up a hotel, right? The good news is that there are a few things that can be done. First, the building design itself can be done in the most environmentally friendly possible manner. So you can be demonstrating a demand for low carbon building materials and skills. Okay. Another is that you can cordon off an area where you're going to allow development for ecotourism, but keep it constrained so that it can't sprawl. So you have this limited space where you're going to have these sorts of developments, but then you expand the protections in the areas around, so that you have strong protection in the ecosystems around your hotel development in your little town. The third way that you can do this is you require biodiversity net gain credits for any development. So if I want to develop a hotel or a road, then there must be another part of the country where I am developing a biodiversity credit to protect something that offsets it. That's something that we've started here in the UK. It started this year for housing developments. If I want to build a new village, 3,000 homes, I have to find somewhere else in the UK where I'm going to protect the land in order to offset the biodiversity damages. If this is well enforced and well managed, then I think it can work. The challenge still comes back to the monitoring, the measurement, and the enforcement. And there need to be strict, well advertised, well promoted fines and taxes and fees for anybody who violates the regulations.
Thank you.
Is there any follow up on that, Martina? Okay. Thank you, Dr. Matthew, for the response. Okay. So I think the question from Martina is the last question that we have today because we have a limited time for this webinar. So thank you, Dr. Matthew and Dr. Maris for the response to the question. Baik, Bapak ini hormati, karena keterbatasan waktu, maka tadi untuk pertanyaan dari Ibu Martina juga merupakan pertanyaan terakhir dalam sesi diskusi kita kali ini. Kami mohon maaf apabila masih terdapat banyak pertanyaan, terutama pertanyaan-pertanyaan yang disampaikan melalui link Slido yang belum terjawab pada sesi diskusi kita kali ini. Mungkin saya akan memberikan sedikit kesimpulan dari sesi pemaparan dan diskusi kita pada seminar sore hari ini. Jadi seperti yang sudah disampaikan bahwa memang keanekaragaman hayati ini memiliki nilai atau value ekonomi yang mungkin lebih tinggi ya dari apa yang sudah kita ketahui saat ini, apalagi terkait dengan tadi ya bagaimana sebetulnya biodiversity ini bisa mendukung ya tujuan untuk pertumbuhan ekonomi melalui PDB ini. Nah, salah satu cara dalam meningkatkan nilai value dari keanekaragaman hayati ini yaitu dengan adanya pembiayaan ya, baik untuk meningkatkan value-nya tadi maupun juga untuk pelestarian dari keanekaragaman hayati itu sendiri. Nah, terkait dengan pembiayaan tadi juga sudah disampaikan oleh Dr. Matthew bahwa kita perlu membedakan ya antara pembiayaan dengan pendanaan. Ketika pendanaan ini tidak memerlukan pengembalian bagi pemberi dana, namun ketika kita bicara dengan pembiayaan, maka kita akan istilahnya memerlukan ya adanya pengembalian dana bagi investor yang tadi memberikan investasi di dalam keanekaragaman hayati. Jadi dengan adanya konsep baru ini mungkin perlu juga kita melakukan ini ya regulasi ya untuk bisa penyusunan regulasi ini bisa menjembatani ya antara kebutuhan pembiayaan keanekaragaman hayati dengan kebutuhan dari pengembalian untuk investor tadi. Jadi kita membaca dari win-win solution dan policy tadi juga dilihat antar satu misalnya dari keanekaragaman hayati, kemudian juga policy untuk hal lain misalnya karbon atau untuk teks dan lain sebagainya, ini juga istilahnya perlu ada trade off dan perlu ada kebijakan yang win-win solution ya di antara keduanya supaya nanti seperti apa tujuan kita terhadap tadi ya pengelolaan keanekaragaman hayati itu sendiri. Nah, dan dengan pastinya dari perumusan regulasi ini untuk mendapatkan win-win solution tadi itu memerlukan sinergi dari berbagai institusi dan sektor itu sendiri. Dan tadi juga sudah disampaikan juga oleh Dr. Maurice terkait dengan pengalaman penerapan green tourism yang ada di negara Laos dan bagaimana dampaknya green tourism tersebut terhadap komunitas yang ada di sekitar pelaksanaan proyek dari green tourism tersebut. Baik, demikian. Selanjutnya sebelum saya menutup sesi diskusi kita pada sore hari ini, sekali lagi saya mengucapkan terima kasih kepada Dr. Matthew dan juga Dr. Morris atas materi yang telah disampaikan pada hari ini. Semoga materi yang kita diskusikan kali ini bermanfaat bagi pengelolaan keanekaragaman hayati di Indonesia. Baik, terima kasih juga kami sampaikan kepada Bapak Ibu seluruh peserta webinar yang sudah aktif mengikuti diskusi pada siang hingga sore hari ini. Saya juga meminta maaf apabila dalam memandu sesi diskusi ini masih banyak kesalahan dan kekurangan. Selanjutnya saya undur diri sampai ketemu pada kesempatan selanjutnya. Saya kembalikan kepada MC kita, Mbak Regina.
Baik, terima kasih banyak kepada moderator kita yang sudah sangat luar biasa hari ini. Kami juga ingin menyampaikan terima kasih. Thank you for our speaker, Mr. Matthew and also Mr. Maurice. Terima kasih atas materi yang sudah sangat luar biasa disampaikan hari ini, serta Bapak Ibu yang telah aktif dalam diskusi. Baik, Bapak dan Ibu sekalian, selanjutnya kita akan mendengarkan closing remarks dari senior economist World Bank. Kepada Mr. David Kachan, kami persilahkan.
Thank you, Bu Regina and Bu Tina and everyone. I know that we're over time, so I'm going to be very brief in these remarks. But I just want to say thanks, of course, for everyone who participated today. I think it's been an excellent discussion. There's two things that stood out to me. One comment was coming from Matthew, Dr. Matthew Agarwala, who told us that we need to change our economic model. So a big picture call to action. And then we also heard from Pak Alu that we need concrete solutions. And it's combining those two things which sometimes feels really difficult. And so I just wanted to reflect on how it is that we can start the process of changing our economic model, but doing so through concrete solutions. So what are the tangible steps that Indonesia and other countries can take, which might not change the whole model overnight, but start the process of doing so? There are things which could be done tomorrow or today. And we've heard about those. And what I liked about today's webinar is that we heard some really practical possibilities. And just to recap what some of those exciting possibilities are. We heard about the need and the opportunity to do natural capital accounts, which BPS is doing and which DJKN is doing as well. We heard about the possibility for raising funds internationally, the fact that there is biodiversity funding internationally. We could have a new biodiversity investment fund. Brazil has one of these. It's raised $200 million and more and supports the biggest national park network on the planet. Indonesia could have that as well. We heard about integrated investment programs like in Laos, a package of investments which is supporting both communities and national parks at the same time. And I think that's a really inspiring example because it has that integrated set of activities. Protection for nature, as well as activities which are giving communities opportunities to get jobs and income from nature and the businesses around it. So an integrated investment program is a possibility for Indonesia and other countries as well. We heard a bit about carbon credits and how those can contribute to also helping biodiversity. What does that require? It requires new regulations, but those are not difficult ideas. Those are things which have been trialed in other countries, and Indonesia already has a carbon market. So extending that in ways that includes forests, includes carbon from forests, and thus includes biodiversity is a good way to get some financing to forests and to biodiversity. We also heard about the possibility for investing in nature-positive businesses. Indonesia, for instance, could consider a nature investment facility which supports businesses and thus encourages private sector money into sectors which support nature, like ecotourism. So these are just 5 possibilities that I pulled out of today's webinar. I'm sure you've got your own takeaway messages, but for me, those were 5 that stood out. Steps which help to change our economic model, but are really concrete solutions which could happen today or tomorrow. So here at the World Bank, we're always delighted to be able to talk about these ideas with you. The World Bank is also ready to support implementation and analysis on ideas like this. So just let us know. And of course, all the best for continuing these conversations inside your ministries. And I hope to continue them with you. So let me finish by just saying thank you to Pak Alu, Wakil Menteri, to Pak Rio, DG, to Pak Arik, who's always our supporter and champion on this agenda, to Dr. Matthew Agarwala, to my colleague, Dr. Maurice Rawlins, and to Butina, Regina, and thanks to all our participants. So looking forward to talking about these ideas further with you. And as always, come to us if you would like, if you have specific questions or ideas that we can help with. Thank you very much.
Oke, thank you Mr. David. Bapak dan Ibu sekalian, kita akan melanjutkan acara kita. Mungkin tadi sudah ada yang mention ya di kolom chat untuk kata kuncinya. Baik Bapak dan Ibu, izin kami mengingatkan sekali lagi bahwa untuk materi absensi serta form evaluasi dapat diakses pada link tree yang sudah disampaikan oleh panitia di kolom chat. Dan di form evaluasi, untuk mendapatkan sertifikat diperlukan kata kunci. Dan sekarang ini saya akan menyampaikan kata kuncinya. Kata kuncinya adalah ke hati. Atau kalau saya ejakan, yaitu Kilo Eko Hotel Alpha Tango India. Sekali lagi, kata kuncinya adalah ke hati. Kilo Eko Hotel Alpha Tango India. Jadi silakan Bapak dan Ibu untuk mengisikan form yang sudah disediakan oleh panitia dan menyampaikan kata kuncinya yaitu ke hati untuk nantinya dapat diproses sertifikat acara webinar kita hari ini. Baik Bapak dan Ibu sekalian, kita sudah sampai di penghujung acara kita pada hari ini. Kami ucapkan terima kasih banyak atas partisipasi Bapak dan Ibu dalam acara webinar kali ini. Semoga materi yang telah disampaikan hari ini oleh para narasumber dapat bermanfaat bagi Bapak dan Ibu sekalian. Dan mohon maaf apabila ada kesalahan, baik kata maupun secara teknis pada acara kita pada hari ini. Sampai bertemu kembali Bapak dan Ibu dalam kesempatan baik lainnya. Selamat sore dan Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Sore, terima kasih Maria.
Terima kasih.